Hi, welcome to Little Pieces Club Ministries podcast. My name is Chris Polad. I'm known as Mr. Chris to the kids at Little Pieces Club small groups. I am a Bible nerd, a child of divorce, and author, and I created Little Pieces Club Ministries around the idea that when our hearts break, God can still make works of art from the broken pieces. I run small groups for children and teens and consult with and support parents. I also give lectures and seminars on request. The content centers around the science of adversity, abuse, and neglect, or ACE science, and how biblical design patterns harmonize with it. We are non-doctrinal and base our teachings on biblical scholarship. And along the way of this path, I discovered that Jesus' story, wrapped in the design patterns of the Good Shepherd and Tree of Life, help us process, grieve, forgive, and reintegrate our souls after trauma and relational toxicity. This helps us grow strong in solitude and community, and leading us and helps us love God, self, and others, which happen to be the most important blessings we can experience and give. The podcast is geared to help parents understand their children's point of view and to be a good shepherd and tree of life through the hard times. You can connect with us at www.littlepiecesclub.com. You can send us an email at littlepiecesministries@gmail.com, and then follow us on socials at LPC Ministries for Instagram, at Club Pieces on Twitter, and at Little Pieces Club on TikTok. We also have a YouTube video channel to look at all of our small groups and the videos that accompany the podcasts. We also have a Facebook site as well. So now let's get into this week's episode. So we are on episode 44, and this is season 2, episode 4, and it is entitled Divorce 101 for Parents, Part 2. If you missed Part 1, go back and listen to it so that today's episode makes a lot more sense. So as I said, this is Part 2, and what we're going to be looking at is defining the science of adverse childhood experiences, and then begin to look at strategies to raise kids well, looking at do's and don'ts for divorced families. But I realized something last week, because we had to go through so much kind of hard science to listen to, especially as a divorced parent, to hear a lot of what's known about the challenges that kids have after divorce and relational toxicity. I decided to put in something that we do with our small groups. And if you guys followed season 1, which is in essence what we do in small groups, you saw that we talked about this frequently. But I think as parents, if you're going to follow the podcast, getting a regular experience with this practice is going to be really good to especially help kind of deal with some of the things that you're dealing with. And so hopefully you enjoy this, and we'll keep it going regularly, and we'll just go ahead and get started. But the idea here is a practice called Examine of Conscience. And so what it is, it's what we do at Little Pieces Club, as I said. We go through each weekly session and ask several questions about how we feel. And so let's just go through it and get to it. So, God, you have given me things to be joyful about. This week I am particularly happy about, and then you take a moment to think about things that have made you happy this week. And then thank God, or God, I thank you for these things. And then the next item that we go through is, it gives me rest and delight to spend time with you alone and with my family and friends. This week, I really liked, and then you think about a time this week that really brought out fun, laughter, and just relaxing time with God. And then after you think about this, just say, thank you, Abba, for this special time. And now we turn to the negative emotions. So God, not all feelings are pleasant, and this week I was disgusted about, and think about something that really turned your stomach this week. And if there's nothing, that's okay. And then we can ask, after we've thought about this, help me deal with these things. And now, next is, God, I know it's okay to be mad. This week, I am particularly angry about, and then we can list those things. And then we can follow this up with, help me forgive and be less angry. And then next is, God, this week, I feel sad about, and spend some time giving yourself permission to feel sad. And then help me understand these things. And then finally, with the feelings, we go to God with, please help me with my fears. This week, I am particularly worried about, and then you can list those things or spend a moment thinking about them or journaling. And then we ask, God, help me be less afraid to trust you. But there's one more dimension that we want to take a look at with this practice, and that is asking ourselves if we have felt that God is near or far from us this week. And so just spend a moment, and if he feels close, thank him for being close, and if he's far, invite him to become closer for you. And we'll do this weekly as our examine of conscience or consciousness. There is another practice called examine of conscience, as just a regular practice to get into to help ourselves be grounded and centered as we start to enter the material. So the next question that we have in front of us is divorce an ACE? And ACE, if you don't know, is shortened for adverse childhood experiences. And so if you look on some lists, divorce is listed, but on other lists, it's not. So when we look at the CDC, or Center for Disease Control, parent separation and divorce is listed as an adverse childhood experience. And primary care providers are asked nowadays to assess for the impact of ACEs. And research reflects that divorce may be an ACE, but is not always an ACE. Divorce rates are still around 50%, but with COVID, we saw a spike. And so there's renewed interest in dealing with divorce. So just to realize that, and we'll talk a little bit more about ACEs, but I think it is wise to consider divorce an ACE. So there is some research done where it's in a book called Beyond the Average Divorce by Dave Demo and Mark Fine. And they concluded that the divorce, it all depends. While low conflict divorces might cause more harm, high conflict marriages might cause harm. So the key might be how we handle interpersonal conflict. And so this leads us to some key policy issues that we can think about. And that is waiting periods, counseling, and then looking at child financial security. So one way to think about this group's work is that divorce's impact is variable and depends on many, many factors. And that's where Little Pieces Club comes in. And when I mentor parents, we can look at a variety of factors that you and your kids have experienced in either coming up with whether or not to divorce or how to handle situations after the divorce. In general, again, at one level or another, divorce is adversity, and the conflict connected with it is adversity as well. So if we look specifically at ACE data, parental separation or divorce in the CDC data hovers around 20 to 25% of people will report that they experienced it growing up. So that's what we're looking at when it comes as a single ACE. Now, we'll get to this, I think, a little bit later, but this term of ACE is almost overly simplified. So did you experience a divorce? Yes or no? That could be one ACE. But what's not listed is how your parents responded, how much conflict there was, And then there are other ACEs about household mental illness, and then neglect, emotional and physical neglect, which could be rolled into both pre and post divorce situations. And so that includes emotional abuse as well. So when you put all of this together, the chances are that divorce is a significant adverse childhood experience for most kids is fairly high. So then what do ACEs really mean for us? And so what we're concerned about is when we look at the whole life perspective of an individual, that the more adverse childhood experiences someone has, the earlier that they die or experience significant complications. And what a lot of work today is highlighting is the fact that we're seeing not just behavioral problems, although behavioral and social problems are much higher in people that have had high ACE scores. The other thing is just general disease and disability sets in at a much higher rate. And we have some explanations of this in terms of how our stress response system works and how adverse childhood experiences tune that as we grow. But there are certainly scientific gaps, but we kind of know now that we have very good visibility on how we're treated as children and when we're young impacts our health as adults. So the next thing that we need to understand is there seems to be a stepwise impact of adverse childhood experiences. And this is also fairly problematic. And that is, again, if we just look at, hey, have you had an ACE? That gives you a 1 or a 2 or a number of ACEs of 3, 4, 5. So we know just with that question that as the number of ACEs that someone experiences increases, that the effects on into adulthood increase as well. And so what this leaves out is the depth and severity of an individual ACE. You could have one ACE that was so severe that it scarred you for quite a while and scarred you very deeply, or 3 relatively minor ACEs where you had good resilience factors and you grew up well. And that's what we're trying to do with Little Pieces Club Ministries, is to help parents understand that part of their post-divorce parenting includes understanding about ACEs and how to build resilience. So outcomes that have been associated with ACEs include the following: suicide attempts, depressive episodes, sleep disturbances, high-risk sexual behavior, fetal mortality, pregnancy outcome problems, increased risk of diabetes and heart attack, poor dental health. And then when it comes to substance abuse, early use of EDOH, or that's a doctor term for alcohol, high risk for mental and substance abuse disorders, continued tobacco use during adulthood, prescription drug overuse, and then lifetime illicit drug use as well. So all of these are outcomes associated with ACE scores. So when we look at divorce and ACEs, we see a couple things. And this goes back to Judith Wallerstein's data that we talked about in the last episode. So children once out of a stable 2-parent home, at least for 2 to 3 years, experience the following: lower financial security, serial adult relationships that increase the potential for abuse, additional divorces, lower quality parenting because the parents are doing the best they can, and then a chance of experiencing additional ACEs increases by Wallerstein's data and others. So there is a very, very interesting case that Dr. Wallerstein followed. And this was several children had 2 parents, and when they would come home at the end of the day, there was a routine where they would both get very drunk. Then they would start to verbally argue and even fight and have some physical altercations, but then they would go into their bedroom and basically have sex. So this went on for a long time. When the kids experienced it, they hid basically under coffee tables or the kitchen table and just waited for it to pass. And for all intents and purposes, when they were out in the community, everything was good. But what Wallerstein noticed was that after this family eventually did divorce, the children missed out on the regularity of their schedule and having a home with both parents. And the mother in particular had multiple relationships with very unhealthy men, and that exposed the children to a high degree of instability. So I don't bring this up to say that this situation was in any way healthy, but it calls to mind the complexity of asking and trying to determine divorce situations, and helps parents make decisions on how they want their households to run after a divorce. It's just highly, highly complicated, but the divorce itself allowed for even the minimal stability of this family to dissolve, and the kids financially and emotionally were worse off not having that stability. So it just makes you think about the depth of relational toxicity and what's really guiding a good outcome in some of these cases. So how can we help so that divorce is not an ace? So first of all, I again apologize that I'm spending so much time on the dark side of what divorce does, but to some degree, you need to kind of go into the divorce situation with your eyes wide open. So over the years, researchers and psychologists have found numerous best practices that are worth knowing about that help tip the scales toward childhood resilience. And so the question, though, is how often are best practices used? And there is evidence that parenting classes do help. But my point about how often are best practices put in place, well, if parents aren't educated about those best practices, it's almost impossible to get them into place with any good regularity. But I want to underscore this next point, and that is building resilience in a child is an intentional act by a parent. Unfortunately, many parents just think, oh, the kids are going to do fine and that they're going to be able to be resilient on their own. And that is extraordinarily wrong. So what we do with Little Pieces Club Ministries is because we are faith-based, although I can have lots of secular conversations if people would like, one of the biggest resilience factors that we have is connecting to the Judeo-Christian family as told to us by the Bible and the biblical design patterns within it. But unfortunately, people take that piece of art and they look at it as something that's wrong. And so this metaphor recently came to me. You can hang a beautiful piece of art on the wall and you can contemplate it and you can let it change your soul, or you can take it off the wall and bash somebody over the head with it. So the issue is how we use a tool that we say God has given to us. And yes, some people have used this tool in very, very evil and terrible ways. But that doesn't mean that the painting that's been held on the wall doesn't have intrinsic value as an object of beauty and meditation. So that's kind of the foundational ideas behind Little Pieces Club. And so remember that resilience comes from intentional work. You just can't rely on your kids to be resilient. And even a newer concept that is coming to light with a lot of trauma-based therapy and that kind of thing is one of the things that we're building that helps build resilience is to understand and address the idea of shame. And again, if we turn to the Bible and we have a picture of a parent figure or God who, no matter what their child, the tribe of Israel, did, whether it was good, bad, or otherwise, that parent stayed with that child because that tribe had intrinsic value to the parent. So one of the messages that we're always constantly trying to get through is that our idea of intrinsic value is different than God's. And so eventually we will lay down our own idea of intrinsic value, whether I do good things or not, to God's value, which is we have no idea why, but He thinks of us as having intrinsic value and worth loving. And when we can embrace that reality, that improves our resilience tremendously. So at last check, there are approximately 20 some states out of 50 that require some form of parental education before going through divorce. So again, when I say that there are best practices out there, it's really hard to see that those best practices are actually put in place with some type of policy. So we can talk about advocating for best practices to be shared without curtailing the right for people to have divorce and to use it as a tool when it is best needed. So again, just realize that while we can talk about a lot of best practices, there's a lot of people throughout this country that may not even know they exist. So then what can be done in the situation of divorce? So now first we're going to look at the don'ts. So what would be the don'ts in dealing with divorce? And in one of the resources that is made available to parents, they have a section that's called Games That Parents Play. So believe it or not, the people that have studied divorce long enough have found patterns in the way people behave after divorce. So they've even named them, and we're going to go through them right now. So the first is I spy, and that is probing the child about the other parent. And then the problem that this causes is it interferes with the child-adult relationship, both with the absent parent and the parent that is doing the questioning. Next is tug of war. We want to gain the child's support in the fight with the ex. And so the kids feel ripped apart and lose respect for the parents in this situation. Messenger. That's the next game. Tell mom or dad, if I don't get Christmas, I won't pay child support. So this interferes also with the child and adult relationship, putting the burden of communication on the child for adult issues is extremely damaging. So what would I do without you? So this is where the parent leans on the child for emotional support. This causes what's called the caregiver child, and that's what we talked about in the last episode. So these are children that feel like they are responsible for the emotional health of the parent. And that is extremely damaging in the fact that it sort of robs children of their childhood and makes them grow up prematurely, which can cause a bunch of relational problems later on. And so next is the money game. So we blame the other parent for money problems. And this then increases a child's feeling of insecurity, and then they want to earn money so they don't feel like a burden to the family. So next, the game is I'm starting over. So parents will go young and act like teenagers, and the kids become embarrassed and confused when parents act like this. And then I owe my kid. So parents go soft and buy kids stuff, and then the kids pick up on this right away, and they know the parents are trying to buy their love. And then over my dead body, parents try to limit visitation due to spite, and the kids feel parents are better off if they weren't around. That means the kids weren't around. They see all the negativity around the visitation, and they just wish that they were out of the situation. So then we have name calling and venting, and this expresses negativity about the ex in front of the kids. Kids can and do identify with the venting parent, and this interferes with emotional development. This has expanded into what we're calling parental alienation syndrome now. And then the guided missile. So using a child as a weapon to influence the other parent. This is unfair to use children, and it really erodes emotional intelligence. So you can see there's lots of things that parents will do that have been documented in the post-divorce situation. So the more you understand about these now, the better it is. So there's games that children play as well. So we don't want to just kind of blame the adults here. So I'll be on your side if you give me what I want. So that was playing one parent off the other. So children are not always accurate, and they can serve a self-interest. And where this comes from is a point of disintegration. They're in essence forming their personality around mom and their personality around dad. And that is actually damaging to their sense of self. Then they can say, but mom or dad says yes. So having separate rules in each home can be a problem. So the point that a parent would need to do or think about is to have good similar rules in both situations. Although it's not always possible, but that's kind of the goal of co-parenting in a divorce situation. Blackmail. I won't come over if you're still dating him. This is a severe power struggle issue where the child is trying to influence the absolute behavior of the parent, and that is pretty rough to deal with. I'll get even with you. Child is acting on anger toward the parent that ended the marriage, and this may require professional help to get down to the anger. So again, remember, below a lot of anger is shame. So, and below shame is any type of child who's experienced abuse, neglect, or adversity very often determines that they did something to either cause or allow the abuse, neglect, or adversity. So divorce, when a divorce happens, kids often think that they were somehow the cause of it. Psychologically, it's easier for the kids to shoulder this burden than to accept the reality that the parents caused the issue, because then they feel like their environment isn't safe and that their parents who they rely on for care are unreliable. So just a little bit about what goes on psychologically in these situations. Okay, let's turn this ship around and let's talk about what we do in a situation of post-divorce. So what's required for good outcomes? Number one, and first and foremost, and we talk about this all the time, is, and you're probably tired of me mentioning it by name, but it's parental alienation syndrome. Parents must contain conflict. And that includes using non-adversarial dispute resolution. So that means friend of the court and not taking things to open court. We want to promote ideal parent-child relationships, and it goes to quality of parenting. And then the other thing that Wallerstein talked about, which was the sleeper effect, is learning how to do marriage. And that is so they can prevent divorce in their own lives. And I'll talk about this resource in just a minute, but one of the best resources I've found is Putting Children First, Proven Parenting Strategies for Helping Children Thrive Through Divorce. It was a book published in 2010, and it was by a woman who ran small groups and studied children of divorce named Joanne Pedro Carroll. It's how I structured a lot of the material that I put into the small groups of Little Pieces Club. So those are the things that she recommends. Other bits of wisdom that I have discovered is try to figure out if your child is highly sensitive. There's an author by the name of Elaine Aaron who runs the website hsperson.com, and there is a 25 item test to see if your child is highly sensitive, because if your child is highly sensitive, they are going to be much more, they're going to feel the effects of the divorce much more than a child who's not highly sensitive. And just so you know, highly sensitive children, the author feels, is very much different than sensory processing disorder. And that's a big rabbit hole that we don't need to go down right now. And then the other thing is check your network. What is your social network? If you are surrounded by friends who are just going to tell you that you're right all the time, that's really not going to be helpful. That's going to lead you down roads that are probably going to get you close to participating in parental alienation syndrome. So try to make sure you've got good, unbiased people who can tell you the truth and to tell you if you're acting in an unhealthy way or not, and that includes potentially getting a therapist. One of the big things that I am a proponent of is for parents to grab their oxygen mask first. A stressed out, depressed parent is not a good parent in a post-divorce situation. So you have to manage your grief and your stress and try to put your best face forward for your children. But that does not mean that you hide any and all feelings from them. And it's a delicate walk and it's a skill. And that's why I think mentoring is important. But if you are sad, if you are grieving, it helps them grieve if they can watch you grieve. So as soon as you can kind of put language around your feelings, it's going to help them know. And also give them permission to have their own thoughts and feelings. Everybody grieves on a different time frame. They will grieve on a different time frame. So just allow them to have their own thoughts and feelings and give them express permission to do so. So some more post-divorce best practices, again, contain conflict. Do not backstab or expect children to do the communicating. Talk open and do not talk openly or negatively about the former spouse. Intentionally build resilience into children, and that means be intentional about noting if they are dealing with some type of shame. What parenting style is best? That is authoritative parenting. And this is opposed to authoritarian. This is my way or the highway parenting. Close or chaotic, where you are your kid's best friend. And distant, which is, I feel terrible, I'm going to keep myself away from my child. Authoritative parenting is warm and loving and sensitive while still laying down rules and following through with consequences and laying down rhythms in the home. And so ultimately, the relationship between both parents is a business-like co-parenting relationship. And that is very difficult and often takes several years to establish because both parents have to go through some process of grief. Next, you have child-centered scheduled planning. Okay, even though I'm saying a schedule, this is probably the biggest area where two co-parenting parents have to get along and be able to cooperate. And that is figuring out the schedule. Planning for holidays, what time during the holiday is the changeover going to happen, when are vacations going to happen, and these have to be flexible based on the needs of kids. And that is especially if they're doing sports or activities, you need to be flexible in the ability to pick up the kids. The worst thing for a child is to be forgotten between two parents who are supposed to pick them up. And then finally, expose children to successful marriage skills. And then allow them to see how you deal with shame. So it will be okay for you to say, hey, mom and dad did not do well in our marriage, and this is why. And then talk about it so the kids understand. Make successful marriage an open topic for any circumstance. So more post-divorce best practices. Set up routines. Routines are the rungs of life, the ladder and the rungs of the ladder that children climb to developmental success. So if you can set up new routines as quickly as possible and preserve old routines as much as you can, that will be very helpful. There are apps. I have a resource page coming up where there's an article that reviews 7 apps that help parents co-parent. Remember, as we've talked about a couple of times, keep kids out of the middle, especially for the younger children. Provide for transition time in the drop-offs. So don't just pull up, transfer the child and leave. one best practice is if you've got a kiddo, plan to eat at a restaurant, and that is one parent eats at the restaurant, so the kids are there, but then have the other parent come, and then as the child finishes the meal, that parent is with them for 5 to 10 minutes, and then continue the transition. So we talked about the games that both parents and kids play. So if these games are particularly strong, attorneys might need to step in. And then there is evidence, especially in Putting Children First by Joe and Pedro Carroll, that faith-based and routine-based interventions like small groups help kids through the divorce situation. And then our issue that we like to make sure parents think about from a Christian and believer side of things is really get into the idea of the Good Shepherd and the tree of life. Because you become a good shepherd for your children and an example of a tree of life for them as well. So if you can embrace that metaphor, and we help you do that at Little Pieces Club Ministries, if you embrace that metaphor, it really provides a stable way for kids to grow and develop on their own. So there is a Children's Bill of Rights, and I'm going to read them off right now. And these are things just to keep in mind. You can maybe even sign this with the other parent during the divorce proceedings. And that is the right to be treated as an important human being with unique feelings, ideas, and desires, and not a source of argument between parents. The next one is the right to a continuing relationship with both parents and the freedom to receive love from and express love for both. The right to express love and affection for each parent without having to stifle that love because of fear of disapproval by the other parent. Next is the right to know that their parents' decision to divorce and separate is not their responsibility, and that they will continue to be loved by both parents. Kids also deserve the right to continuing care and guidance from both parents, and the right to honest answers to questions about the changing family relationship, and then the right to know and appreciate what is good in each parent without one parent degrading the other. Do you hear a common theme? Trying to prevent parental alienation syndrome. Next is the right to have a relaxed, secure relationship with both parents without being placed in a position to manipulate one parent against the other. We will spend a lot of time in podcasts talking about secure attachment and how divorce can upset secure attachment. So this is very, very important. Next is the right to have both parents not undermine the other parent's time with the children by suggesting tempting alternatives or by threatening to withhold parental contact as a punishment for the children's wrongdoing. Next is the right to experience regular and consistent contact with both parents and to be protected from parental disputes or disagreements. So again, consider writing these out and having both parents sign them at the time of divorce. So I'm going to throw out a really crazy idea, and that is a marriage funeral. If you think about it, a lot of people ask whether or not or how divorce impacts children. And some people say it's kind of like the death in a family. And the problem with that idea is that although deaths are very, very tough, they are a single event that you then have anchored in time and that you need to deal with. A marriage that ends in divorce is an ongoing process. And that's part of the issue, is that kids are always growing and developing. They're going to, as their brains grow, they're going to reprocess the divorce. And that's going to require parents to then go back and help them reprocess the events. So the idea of a marriage funeral is sort of an open idea, but it actually provides you with an event in time that will allow the children to realize that that marriage is over. But the nice thing about a marriage type funeral is it can be a recommitment for the parents to co-parent together and make promises to the children on how they're going to co-parent. Honestly, this idea requires a ton of emotional security and intelligence on the side of the parents. And so it's probably going to be very difficult to do. But I want to put this idea out there for people to consider, because it has a huge promise for helping kids process. And again, Little Pieces Club Ministries is about parents connecting with the vision and experience that children have with the divorce. And so a funeral allows people permission to begin the grieving process. And so as you're framing the grieving process with the children, they can grieve what used to be, and that is the good things that were connected before the divorce, but then can begin to reconnect with a hope and a future of what can come later. So other things to think about, to keep in mind, and that is divorce is a process. It's not an event. As children grow older, they need to reprocess the divorce, as I just said. And the stage of separation prior to the legal divorce is especially trying for adults and children. And remember that depression makes parenting very difficult. So it's important for you to identify trusting other adults that you can, the kids can maybe do an overnight with, where they feel safe, and that if you need time to grieve on your own, just let them know that might be happening more and more. And again, as I mentioned, you can allow them to see you grieve, but be very careful that you're not undermining the other parent. So that does take some forethought and some work to be able to do that. Lean on your primary care provider to screen for depression and anxiety and substance abuse and relationship toxicity and sexuality with your children. I know it's a very difficult topic to think about, but divorce does put kids at higher risk for several types of mental health issues. So resources, so parents.com has a couple articles that you can search for. The first one is the best co-parenting apps. And then the next one is 9 rules to make joint child custody work. And this was in part the author that I already mentioned, Joanne Pedro Carroll, contributed to this article as well. So for more resources, I already mentioned Putting Children First, Proven Parenting Strategies for Helping Children Thrive Through Divorce by Joanne Pedro Carroll. And then the other foundational work is The Unexpected Legacy of Divorce. And this is by Judith Wallerstein and is a summary of her 25-year study where she followed kids of divorce. So it really, really goes a long way for helping parents see the divorce through the children's eyes so that you can make the best decisions possible as their good shepherd. And then, of course, Little Pieces Club resources, my website where I will have articles posted periodically. I just published a book called Do Clouds Get Divorced Too? It's a really wonderful way to sit with your child and read it together, little bits at a time, and then it prompts you with questions to help them process what the main characters are going through. And it's just a shout out to Sleeping Bear Dunes, because a lot of the illustrations are inspired by Sleeping Bear Dunes. I'm working on a Marriage 101 book. So it's a pre-marriage book with a lot of skills that it's like a daily devotional with skills to help get ready for marriage. And then after that will be a marriage rescue book. So I've got several books that are on the way. You have our podcast. So season 1 is the small group curriculum that you can do at home if you wanted to, through resources available on the website. But it's also meant to increase transparency. So if an absent parent is uncomfortable with our small groups, that they can go through a full podcast about what we go over and why. And then season 2 is parental concerns. So it's addressing common issues brought up in parent mentoring so that you're prepared for that. Next, Little Pieces Club has a small group that it runs, and I'm looking to increase the number. So if you are listening to this and would like to start a small group, please reach out. Then I do a teen small group as well, and then parent mentoring. And so again, looking at our logo, it is a tree of life that has multiple depths of meaning to it. And so Little Pieces Club Ministries is all about adversity science meeting health healing biblical design patterns. So that's another resource that's available. So what about a toxic or unreasonable ex, or an ex with mental health issues or severe trauma themselves? How do you deal with all of this? So there are a few tips for dealing with a toxic ex. And number one is that risk for parental alienation syndrome. And do not try to be the nice guy and just kind of take everything in stride. These situations require family therapy versus individual therapy, which has its place, but the issue is, how do we all get along together and communicate? And state laws may require both parents for children to have therapy, but when it comes to dealing with the toxic ex, remember 3 words: patient, kind, and courageous. Courageous is probably the hardest one, but if you hear that there's a narrative about you, you can push back against that narrative, but you don't have to do it in a negative way. You can basically say, one thing would be to say, look, here's a coin. What's on one side of the coin? Well, heads. Well, what's on the other side of the coins? Tails. Well, mommy is seeing heads and daddy is seeing tails. So that's why you're getting 2 different stories from mom and dad. I wish it could be different, but that's how it is for right now. And mommy and daddy are trying to communicate better. And then again, in this conversation, you can give your children permission to think for themselves about what they think is going on and to keep lines of communication open. Assume that your child is feeling some type of shame as part of this, and give them messages very frequently that you see them and you think that they are very good people, and if they feel like they've made any mistakes, that they're welcome to tell you about them. I mentioned earlier the apps. If people can't talk face to face, one of the apps actually has a emotional toxicity detector and helps you kind of phrase things in a more positive way. I do say to keep a log of things, but keep it to be just the facts. Do not write it to intentionally impugn the other ex. And then again, be aware of the games that both adults and kids play. Attorneys may need to be involved, and parents must actively support the relationship with the other parent, even though it may seem very difficult to do. The kids get caught in loyalty traps between parents, and so you want to help them frame those issues moving forward. So basic advice for making step families work: verbal praise rather than physical helps in the initial phases. So that means don't expect, if you're the step parent, don't expect kids to be very physical with you, because they're getting caught in a loyalty trap. If I begin to love this person, will that mean my mom gets upset or my mom is loved any less? And so really just be very kind and patient with step families as you're moving forward. The custodial parent must be responsible for the discipline of their child. Commonly, moms will kind of let the new stepfathers become the disciplinarian. That really is not a great dynamic, especially in the initial phases. If a step has a concern about the way that a custodial parent is handling something, it is best dealt with silently behind closed doors, or go for a walk where the children can't hear. Have frequent family meetings for airing concerns. I'll do an upcoming podcast on the Indian talking stick idea that Stephen Covey put forward back in the 80s. It's a great mechanism for family meetings. Steps need to be respectful and supportive. And I say both with the right brain and the left brain. A lot of people say, well, I said the words right, but if our behaviors are working against that, that's a problem too. So steps need to be respectful and supportive of the previous children that a custodial parent has. There are so many horror stories of step parents coming in and essentially forcing a custodial parent to make a choice between them and abandoning their children. And I cannot tell you how emotionally and psychologically devastating that is. And then always remember that you can get professional help. Okay, guys, we get to take a breath. So one of the other things that I'm doing after especially an intense episode like today is putting another moment where we can re-center and ground ourselves. And that is in the practice of Lectio Divina. It's a very simple practice, and I hope you get used to it with these podcasts. And so what it is, it's a 4-step reading of Scripture where we open ourselves to a direct communication from Scripture to our hearts. And so today is going to be Romans 8:26. So I'm just going to read this through, but since this is a podcast, I'm going to alert us to a particular word or phrase that is speaking, speaks to us. But feel free to do this on your own, where you pick a piece of Scripture and just a word or a phrase is going to stick out to you, and you get to meditate on that for a short period. So Romans chapter 8, verse 26. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So in that first read through, what stood out to me was Spirit helps us. So in the dark times of dealing with the stress after divorce, we can remember that the Spirit of God helps us in our weakness. So what we're going to do is we're going to reflect on how that Spirit needs to help us today. So I'm going to read it through again. Likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. Scholar Kenneth Bailey noted in Paul Through Mediterranean Eyes that the connotation of spirit, actually in deep Middle Eastern context, has the feminine in mind. So I do bring that up from time to time to help people process things. So especially women who might be caught up in sort of this male-dominated mode can realize that the Spirit in the Trinity has the connotation of femininity. So anyway, just wanted to point that out. So now we can decide how we're going to respond to the Spirit. And that means we can accept the Spirit's help or realize that maybe we're in a posture that can't accept the Spirit's help. And we can then ask ourselves and spend some time on why we can't accept help from the Spirit. So likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So then finally, we rest once we've made a decision about how we're going to respond. And the posture we take here is resting like we're fully filled, like the good shepherd's sheep who has had their fill and can lay down and rest and put their head on maybe the lap of the good shepherd. So likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness, for we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words. So I hope this is kind of a nice grounding moment for you after some of the intense information that we had to go through. And now we can pray this episode of the podcast to an end. and then recover and think through what it means for us. So, dear Heavenly Father, we take a moment just to remember your presence throughout all human history and how you guide us like a good shepherd, and how, if we want, we can see our story connected to that thousands of years old story. You meet us where we are and connect with us and show us the path. Contemplating and living through divorce is very hard, Father. Any believer going through this needs your presence as a good shepherd. Call to us so that we hear and know your voice, though we are in a dark valley. Lead us back to the safety of the 99 that you left to come find us. Along the way, allow us to drink your living water and eat and lay down in a lush field. Fend off the robbers and demons trying to tear us apart, and inspire us with your patient and kind love. We will need to parent our children like you, with patience and kindness and courage, to help them grieve and emerge from childhood with minimal shame. Lord, we cannot do this without you. Work quickly, Lord, but we will humbly wait for you. In your name we pray. Thank you for spending time with Little Pieces Club Ministries. Feel free to like and comment and share. Have a good week until our next podcast.